Welcome from me as well. Thank you. I was so inspired. I really do hope we can take the text of Claire's address and turn it into a poem. I think what Michael Rosen could do with that list. So I have to say that's my summer project, to take that list of where you will find English graduates, because she really has done my job for me. So thank you very much for such an inspiring introduction, and thank you, Holly, another careers researcher specialist, for endorsing that in the Q&A. So I'd like to welcome you now to our PhD alumni panel. So to introduce myself, I'm Liz Wilkinson. I'm a senior careers consultant for the University of London Career Service, and it's also my joy and my pleasure to be the careers consultant of the School of Advanced Study and particularly the Institute of English Studies. But most of all, it's my pleasure to host this panel, to welcome Bethany, Emma, Ellie and Maria to share their experiences as recent English PhD graduates. The format of this session is that I've asked them all to speak for around 5 minutes on their PhD and career experiences, and we'll take that, we'll ask them to speak in order, and they know the order. I'll be queuing them in. But I want you, as you listen to them, which you can see we've got the Q&A enabled, and I'd like you to type your questions as they occur to you. If you're anything like me, when you think of a question, type it in so that you're not trying to remember it. Ellie and I are going to be managing that Q&A, and then when all of our 4 speakers have spoken, we'll then take some time, and it's great that Claire has given us a couple of extra minutes so we can have a really good sort of 25 minutes of Q&A and conversation. Also, and this is a new one for me, but Ellie's encouraging me, you will have the scope to upvote questions. So if someone puts in a question and you think, oh, that's a really good question, I really do hope Liz picks that out, then please upvote it, and we'll do our best. I am staggered that we have 142 participants in the room. So thank you, and a great question from JJ. So we are recording the session, and so we'll find ways of making it available. So I know many of you will have caring commitments, so we'll do our best to give you some recording and some other times to access it. But first we need to co-create. And so as much as my panelists, so I'm going to hand over to in a moment, that co-creation comes from you. I scrolled down the participants list and I saw some familiar names, not, of course, some of my students from the School of Advanced Study, but it was a particular joy to also see some of my other PhD students that I work with from the Technique Doctoral Partnership. You know how I rock, you know how lively I like things to be. So Claire has inspired me. I'm afraid I have to confess that I am a classicist. So what I need you to prove to me is that English PhDs are more lively than classics PhDs, which is a bit of a challenge. So I'm hoping that you can take, thank you, Charlotte. I'm sure we have other creative writing PhD students in the room. Absolutely sure that's true. And also what we're covering is relevant to the whole discipline of English, because what I have discovered, and what I think we're about to hear from our panelists, is that like all the humanities, as Claire says, English is a broad church. So it has all those aspects of history, creativity, linguistics, textual analysis. So you will find very many disciplines in here, but I'm sure you're not alone with creative writing. Super. So that's a little intro from me. So it's my pleasure to kick off the panel, and I'm going to ask Beth Worley to start us off. So Beth, could I invite you to unmute and kick us off with your 5 minutes on your PhD experiences and your careers experiences. Thank you.
Hello, thanks Liz. Thanks everyone for joining today. And thank you to Ellie and to Claire for inviting me to participate today. I had my PhD viva in February 2020. So I basically stepped out of doctoral study and straight into the pandemic. And obviously, there have been moments of real doubt for me. So it does feel like a huge, huge privilege to be speaking to you today about my work and the path that I took to get here. At the moment, I'm a cultural coordinator for the local authority. I'm also a medievalist. Before I talk about that, I'm going to go back to the beginning. So I came to my PhD having worked in marketing for an academic publisher. And the PhD project that I took up was at King's. And it was a really intriguing partnership set up by Claire between the English department, the geography department, and a charity called the Canal and River Trust. And the idea of that project was to take interdisciplinarity and public engagement seriously. So my thesis on the face of it was about waterways in early medieval literature, but it was also about taking the concept of water and using it as a medium for thinking across disciplines and boundaries. And I think that kind of goes back to what Claire was saying at the beginning about the kind of porous boundaries of English as a whole. The partnership with Canal and River Trust was a really integral part of my PhD experience. They have a public art programme called Arts on the Waterways, and I was assigned to a particular project of theirs based on a stretch of waterways in Worcestershire. And during that time, I basically took on any task that the team would let me get my hands on. So helped with admin, wrote research blogs, interviewed artists, organised a symposium. And it was really this experience that stimulated my interest in local places. And that's something that's become really core to my professional identity now. So in the 18 months after my Viva, I had 2 short postdocs. The first one was 3 months on the Making Bristol Medieval project, where I worked with researchers and local historians to make a map of Bristol in the 15th century. And then I spent 6 months at Freie Universität Berlin, where I was continuing to think and write about water and places and time. And I also continued collaborating with the producer from the Worcestershire Waterway project. So working first as an associate historian for the Forest of Dean Sculpture Trail, and then as associate historian for a new exhibition at the Bristol Beacon Concert Hall. And during that time, I was obviously also applying for a lot of jobs, permanent, semi-permanent jobs, and assessing and reassessing my career priorities. For me, those priorities never really came down to the kind of core question of either pursuing academia or not pursuing academia, even though I think when you're finishing up a PhD, that the choice is often framed in those terms. So I kind of chose to think about other priorities instead, where I wanted to make my home, and continuing to do the public engagement work that had really inspired me when I was working with the Canal and River Trust. So that's how last autumn I ended up applying for my current job as a cultural project coordinator. It's actually technically two identical fixed-term jobs in 2 market towns in Somerset. So for one of them, I'm employed by Keynsham Town Council, the local authority, and then for the other one, I'm employed by a charity, Midsummer Norton Community Trust. And both of those roles are funded by Historic England as part of their nationwide High Street Heritage Action Zone project. Now that project is essentially about public realm regeneration, so things like shopfront improvements and other high street works, but they also have a really core to their programme cultural regeneration project, which is my responsibility. So for each of the towns, I lead a consortium of local representatives to organise cultural events and activities centring on the high street. If you've been to either Keynsham or Midsummer Norton, you'll know that they're pretty typical high streets. I think it's fair to say that neither are of kind of outstanding historical significance, but they do have their stories that are worth telling. And we've been doing that through mini festivals, markets, workshops, a new heritage trail, a community grant programme, and a filmmaking project, amongst other things. It's a really exciting thing to be a part of, and it really does feel like it's being made by the community for the community, which is essential for the success of these kind of projects. The single biggest challenge for me, I think, has been delivering what is a very ambitious programme and meeting the kind of funding deadlines that Historic England set, while simultaneously getting to grips with the complicated bureaucracies of local government and understanding the very many conflicting agendas and voices in the mix. But the good news is that when I applied for this job, I think having a PhD was definitely more of a help than a hindrance. In the case of this role, the actual substance of my research was useful because I know about history and about placemaking. But I think on a more subtle level, storytelling has been key to this. So both of these towns are a little lacking in your sort of visual heritage assets. So having the ability to work with creators and draw out stories has been essential. There were definitely some areas I had to work on as well. And I'd say that anyone interested in a role like this, firstly, needs to develop their project management experience if they don't have any already. You can make the argument, I think, that doing a doctoral research project is a form of sort of micro project management. But it would be even better to have experience of organising a conference, for example, something where there are stakeholders beyond just you and your supervisor, and where there's a budget to manage as well. There are a lot of good courses actually on FutureLearn around project management, and it is reasonably intuitive, but there's a kind of language of Gantt charts and risk and dependencies that you might want to get to grips with. The other thing would be to develop your understanding of local government. A lot of local authority meetings are actually open to the public. Many of them are now hosted online, as we know from Jackie Weaver. So if you can, go along to a meeting, find out the kind of priorities and the challenges that are faced by local councils. And I will actually end by saying that if a career in arts and heritage is of interest, this is actually a reasonably good time to be entering the public sector, with kind of post-COVID economic recovery and the government's levelling up agendas. It means that money is actually on the table for these kind of roles, not that they are hugely lucrative, but 10 to 15 years ago, public sector arts programming jobs were quite rare. So there's a little positive for us to end on. Thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to discussing more in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Beth, and I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions. I'd just like to thank Chiara for starting us off with a question. So if that's a question, and encouraging people to upvote. So we'll come to that question later, but I would like to assemble some questions as we go through. Beth, I've already got questions in my mind, but I also would like to just thank you for the statement that actually this is quite a good time to be getting into public programming because of the economic recovery. So again, an example that there are opportunities. So that's a lovely positive message. So that's Beth. So thank you. So I think your question's for her, but now I'd like to hand over to Maria and invite you to give your perspective on a very different field.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you, Beth, for your amazing experience that you shared with us. Can I first ask, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. And also, please, if I'm running over time because I'm too caught up in what I want to say, just feel free to shout at me, just literally shout at me. Okay, so my name is Maria Kohut. I have a PhD in English Lit that I'll talk about a bit more in a minute. And I currently work as feature editor for Medical News Today, a Healthline Media website. So this is a medical science website with a global audience. We've got millions of views every month. But let me start by talking a little bit about my trajectory, how I went from English PhD, which is a completely different background, to essentially a science communication role. So I saw somebody in the Q&A mentioning that they had done creative writing, and I just want to start by saying, before my English PhD, I did a BA in English and creative writing, and then I did a master's degree in panromanticisms, which was very specific. And then finally, I went on to do my PhD in English and comparative literary studies at the Uni of Warwick, where I also did my previous degrees. And again, I had a super specific thesis. It was on the relationship between female figures and their mirrors in the literature and the art of 19th century Britain. And I officially graduated in 2018. But I actually got my current non-academic job a year before graduation. So as I was getting to the end of my PhD, I was already starting to consider potential job options, as no doubt everybody is. But I was in a situation, I guess, to be honest, where I needed to support myself financially, and I needed a stable income that wasn't really forthcoming through academic part-time jobs at the time. And I think I also needed a change of scene after my PhD. I really enjoyed my research, and I still do. I still do some of that research independently as an independent scholar. And I especially enjoyed the teaching during my PhD. But after a few years of navigating this all-consuming world of academia, I felt quite burnt out. And I'm sure those of you who've finished a PhD or who are drawing towards the close of their PhDs probably know what I'm talking about, because as we know, sometimes there aren't really any clear boundaries between work life and personal life. When you're working towards a PhD, you're always on, you're always thinking about your research. So add to this the kind of burden of financial insecurity, and you have the whole picture of why I was considering non-academic jobs. So I sort of fell into journalism by accident. I was already interested in journalism and communication and digital media. But I found the job that I became my current role through friends of friends, in fact, who suggested it to me. So the role that I initially applied for was a staff writer role. It was a news writer role for Medical News Today. That required the applicant to have experience writing and researching, but also a STEM background, which I didn't have, so I didn't fit the job spec 100%. Still, I applied and I got the job. And since then, I've grown. I've evolved in my role. I'm no longer a staff writer. I'm a feature editor, which means I have a lot more responsibilities. I oversee a busy feature publication schedule on a weekly basis. I liaise with writers, with fact checkers, with copy editors. I get to interview top researchers in their respective fields, which is really exciting. And I'm actually even involved in the in-house podcast production. So I guess I was asked to think a little bit about the challenges and about the positives of my current role. And I'm going to start with the challenges so I can work towards the positives. In terms of challenges, I have to admit that it can be a very stressful type of role. Deadlines are a deadly reality. If anything, they're more pressing than they were during my PhD, because they're often hard deadlines and the stakes are higher. You can't really just not publish. There's lots of pressure in the newsroom. And honestly, sometimes as a journalist, you get to hear some quite traumatic life stories from contributors. For instance, in my line of work, from people with a life-altering condition. It can be very sad. So I think actually the kind of mental health impact from journalistic work can be underestimated. It can really take a toll. So you have to be prepared for that, I think, if you want to go into journalism. I also work with teams across different time zones, different continents. So coordinating and still kind of maintaining that work-life balance can be a challenge sometimes. So you really have to kind of learn to set boundaries. But there are lots of good, positive angles to my job that I didn't really expect getting into it. So I guess one thing that maybe everybody can relate with, unlike with academic work, when it can take a while to receive positive feedback on what you've published, or sometimes you don't really know what the impact has been of the work that you've put out into the world with journalism. The feedback is almost immediate. The impact is immediately visible. You know that people are appreciating what you've written or what you've edited because they will talk about it, they will share it, and you will also see, you know, how many views an article has had and so on. It's a very stimulating job. It never gets boring. There's so much varied work that's involved in this role, from writing to editing, collaborating with researchers, recording interviews, coming up with new sorts of projects and so on. I've learned so much about medical science and about biology and things that I never thought I would know about, but just kind of working with these sorts of fields day to day. I've learned to really get into it. I picked up interviewing and public speaking skills. I've always been quite a nervous public speaker, and I still am a little bit, but I've got over that a lot more thanks to the fact that I always have to go out there and interview people. I'm no longer scared of, I guess, cold calling and sending out emails and getting the materials that I need to obtain. In terms of the transferable skills that I brought into the job when I got it, I would say what's most important is research skills, just day-to-day research skills that you're sure to have built during your PhDs, attention to detail, ability to self-organize, ability to manage your time properly, resilience to stress. So, I mean, I guess as PhDs, there's always an amount of stress and pressure, and you build up resilience. And that's really important in an always-on job, such as a journalistic job. So knowing, being able to meet hard deadlines, having good communication skills, an ability to prioritize tasks and also to juggle competing priorities sometimes. And a question that I was asked in my interview for the newswriter's role that stuck with me was, so the interviewer said, imagine that everything's on fire all the time. How do you deal with that? And I guess this is something that I learned during my PhD. I'm sure all of you have learned that as well. That's really important to bring to the table. So again, open and effective communication is something that I brought. Flexibility, adaptability, being a fast learner, and the ability to translate sort of academic jargon into something that wider audiences are able to understand is really important in journalism, and especially in kind of specific journalism like science communication. And of course, networking skills, which you will have built during conferences, for instance, also very important in journalism as you build up a network of writers and contributors and researchers that will help you facilitate. So if you want to get a job in journalism or kind of anywhere outside of academia, I think, first of all, if you have a very set idea, maybe about, oh, I can only do one thing, this is why I'm doing this PhD. I'm only good at one thing. I'm not good at anything else. I think you need to try and reframe the way that you think about your career trajectory. Maybe think like, what is the essence of what you want to do in life? What are you good at in more kind of general terms to help you gain more flexibility in the way that you think about jobs and in the way that you structure your job applications. So for example, I think of myself in very broad terms as a writer, as a researcher, and as an educator. And I think a lot of different jobs fit that description. You may want to draw a mind map of your skills and ways in which you can apply them. And you can use this when you write up your job applications. Talk to everyone you know about the fact that you're looking for jobs and the sort of things that you're open to, because you never know where opportunities come from. Keep pursuing your personal interests outside of your academic research, because that's really important. It will help you think about what non-academic jobs might be a good fit. It will help you develop other skills, and employers might also like to see what other interests you have. It might actually be a plus for you. Don't be afraid to apply for jobs where you don't fit the job spec 100%. You just have to remember to kind of foreground the most relevant experience that you have in your CV, in your cover letter, and during the job interview. And I'm not sure if I have 1 minute. I want to share something with everyone, if that's okay.
Absolutely fine.
Okay. So I actually asked the manager who interviewed me for my job why she hired me. And this is what she said, and I'm going to try and share my screen with you. So you don't have to take my word. Can you see that? Is that okay? Okay, good. So you don't have to take my word for why I got this job. So essentially, I know somebody asked why would the PhD be an issue? Well, a PhD might be an issue if you've gone from like BA to master's to PhD without any other like full-time jobs in between. And so on paper, it doesn't look like you have a lot of real-world experience. So I asked my manager if that was a concern to her, and she said it was. But she was also aware of the kind of discipline that it takes to do a PhD and of the skills that go into being a doctoral researcher. And she was also really interested in my reasons for stepping away from academia. And the other thing was my other stuff, really. All of my hobbies and my interests outside of academia that I also foregrounded in, I guess, my online presence that she picked up on. And the fact that she saw that I was eager to learn and that I was a fast learner. And that's it. Thank you very much. You can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn if you want. And I'm going to shut up now.
That was wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And, you know, I can see that it stimulated a lot of questions in the chat box, which we will be picking up at the end. But you know, thank you very much. And, you know, I really picked up from that was something that you said, which I will be asking you about later, Marie, is about how you've continued as an independent scholar. So I'm just giving you my notice of one of my questions later. But we're going to move now from the world of journalism to the world of publishing. So I'm going to hand over to Emma to share her perspectives.
Thanks so much, Liz. And thank you very much for the invitation to be part of the panel. I'm absolutely delighted to be speaking with everybody today. It was so great to hear how Beth and Maria have started to develop their careers following their PhDs. So thanks so much for sharing your experiences as well. So I carried out my PhD at Lancaster University way back in 2011, and it seems like a long time ago now. So it was in music, but my main focus was on narrative in the music of a particular composer called Thomas Adès, and that narrative focus really drew very heavily on my previous study in English literature. So the result was quite an inherently interdisciplinary PhD across music and English. So when I started my PhD, I was fully intending to go into academia afterwards. But my career plans definitely evolved throughout my study for a variety of reasons, I think, which I won't go into now, but I'm very happy to elaborate on those later if that will be helpful. But I'd been gaining a little bit of editorial experience at the same time as doing my PhD, and this work was something that I was really enjoying. So I eventually made the decision to pursue a career in publishing. And other than a really short 15-month stint in research management about 4 years ago, I've been working in publishing in the 11 years since I graduated. So I've held editorial roles in book publishing across the humanities, especially music, but across most of the humanities. Firstly at Ashgate Publishing, where actually I worked with Beth for a small amount of time. And then Routledge as well, where I worked from my way from assistant editor through to commissioning editor. And then more recently, I was commissioning editor at Epigeium, which is part of Oxford University Press, and I was publishing digital research and development courses there. And then I started my current role as books manager at the University of London Press back in June last year. And the University of London Press is primarily an open access press. We publish around 20 to 25 books a year across the humanities, and I oversee the full books programme there and lead the commissioning in my role. So a really rewarding part of my role, and in editorial books publishing roles in general, actually, is the variety of different research areas I get to work with on a daily basis. So as a PhD researcher, you're mostly focusing on your own very highly specialised field, and that's rewarding in itself, of course, but I do find it hugely exciting to be able to work with a range of researchers who, you know, they're all at the forefront of their fields, and I get to learn about a whole variety of new research that's happening across disciplines. So that's something I find really motivating about this role. I'm also really interested in kind of the actual practice of scholarly publishing itself, and as part of the research culture in academia in general. And so the fact that the University of London Press is a predominantly open access publisher is something hugely important, both to my personal values, but also quite intellectually interesting to me as well, particularly at the moment, as we're right in the middle of redeveloping the press's open access publishing model. So that's fascinating at the moment. As we're a really small press with a really small team, the role is very broad and varied, and it involves getting stuck into all aspects of the publishing process from start to end, and, you know, involves the running of the press as well. So again, that was something really that attracted me to the role, but it does come with its challenges, of course. So long hours, as Maria said, handling competing priorities is something that's, you know, a daily thing that we've got to do. Lots of negotiation, meeting deadlines, relationship management. These sorts of areas can be where some of the challenges lie, but I don't think that's particularly exclusive to publishing. I think those challenges are common to many jobs. So it's something that you'll definitely be getting to grips with during your PhDs and setting yourself in a good place for a career afterwards. So on that, there's a number of different transferable skills I think my PhD did equip me with for a career in publishing. I could probably talk all afternoon about that, but I'll just pull out some of the key ones now. So I think the ability to retrieve and synthesize and analyze quite a large amount of information, and to be able to communicate that in an accessible way to others, that's a fundamental part of undertaking a PhD, and is so helpful in a publishing role too. So for example, if you're researching an idea for a new book series, or if you're looking at patterns and trends in libraries' interest in book topics in the areas you're publishing in, for example, that sort of ability to synthesize a lot of information can be really valuable. Project management skills, yep, definitely, that comes in useful every day. I think a key one is that something that doctoral researchers actively develop is the ability to ask well-formulated and curious questions to explore a topic in depth. And this is such a useful skill as an editor, for example, if you're discussing a new book project idea with authors, or exploring publishing partnerships with organisations. So it really helps to get those projects and relationships off to a really great start to begin with. And it shows that you can kind of think carefully and critical about all the available options right from the outset, you know, the potential a project might have, any pitfalls, that kind of thing. And then finally, having a good understanding of the research and higher education landscape in general is absolutely essential. And your doctoral experience provides you with that really thorough understanding of scholarly practice and the conventions and contexts around academic publishing that can be really key in understanding authors' needs and in evaluating new book proposals. It's something that you'll learn on the job anyway, but you've already got a massive head start having been in that research environment doing your PhD. So I have a whole bunch of tips for PhD graduates looking for an editorial role, but I'm going to focus on just my top 3 for now, I think. So the first one, I think, is probably a key one, but look to get some relevant work experience in advance of starting to apply for jobs. And I know that's easier said than done, particularly, you know, people juggling caring responsibilities at the same time as your PhD. But I found that even just a tiny amount can help. So publishing is quite a competitive industry to get into. Just to give you an idea, I was competing with around 100 other applicants to get my first editorial assistant entry-level role at Ashgate. And so any experience at all that can enable you to show that you already have some of the knowledge and skills in the area, and that you kind of showing a commitment to the publishing industry to begin with, can help you stand out. So while I was doing my PhD, I took on a voluntary editorial role for the University Postgraduate magazine. And I was doing a little bit of freelance editing for a journal at the time. And I just want to stress it wasn't loads of extra work that I was taking on, but it was enough to show Ashgate that I'd been getting some of those relevant skills in those essential areas. And, you know, along with, of course, having the understanding of academic research that you gain while you're doing your PhD. The second tip that I'll pull out is be open-minded about the role that you might initially take in publishing. So as there's just a handful of assistant editor or editor roles in particular subjects across the country, you might be waiting a really long time before you see a vacancy come up in English or whatever your primary field is. So maybe consider applying for your first role in a different subject area potentially. And something else to consider actually, if editorial roles are few and far between, is applying for a role in a different area of publishing, such as marketing or production or digital, for instance. So this can provide you with some valuable experience in publishing that can put you in a good position for when that editorial role finally does become vacant. And it can give you a useful perspective on the work that others in your editorial team might not have. This can be really useful. And then my final tip is that if you do find and apply for a publishing vacancy in English or your field, don't assume your PhD speaks for itself in the interview. So while the interviewers will be really pleased to hear about your subject knowledge and that specialism in the field will be really useful, you'll also have to make it really clear to them how the transferable skills you've gained while carrying out your PhD are relevant for the publishing role you're applying for. And your skills absolutely will be relevant for all the reasons I've mentioned. But yeah, it's just a case of kind of prepping a few concrete examples with that job spec in mind in advance. So I'll wrap up there, but I'm very happy to answer any questions later or elaborate on any of those points. Thank you.
Super, thank you very much. And yeah, some great points there and stimulated already quite a number of questions in the chat box, which we'll be coming back to later. One of the things I picked out was your comment that having a thorough understanding of scholarly practice gave you a head start. I suspect that was also true for our final speaker, who's Ellie, who, like me, works in university professional services. So over to you, Ellie, to do your session, and we've got plenty of time, so take your time.
Thank you very much, Liz, and yes, thank you to all of our great speakers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I have been up to since my PhD. So I'm Ellie, as Liz has said. I'm the Institute Manager at the Institute of English Studies. I'll say a little bit more about what that role involves in a moment. I completed my PhD in 2019, and it focused on the poetry of a very niche 17th century writer and public figure. And I used his verse as a lens to explore questions about imitation, masculinity, and homosexuality in the period. I loved my PhD and I hated it in equal measure, which I think is a fairly common experience. I really enjoyed the teaching and researching and learning new things. I loved feeling that I had a specialism, you know, particularly when you're getting to that writing up stage. It's quite an exciting feeling that you are the world expert on something, even if it's something incredibly niche. But it was actually that same sort of nicheness that was also what I didn't enjoy about the PhD. I found it a very lonely experience. In my case, I think that was heightened by the fact that I was living in a different city to where I was doing my PhD. So I didn't feel quite so much part of the research community as I might have done at my institution. But even if I'd been able to attend every single seminar, and I attended quite a lot, or I'd always been in the shared study space, it is still a lonely experience, as I'm sure many of you will agree. When I completed my PhD, I had this huge sense of achievement, but I did also feel quite lost. I wasn't sure if I wanted to continue researching and try and get a job as an academic researcher, or if I wanted to do something completely different. And being completely honest, I was also slightly jealous of friends who had been in stable, secure employment since finishing their undergraduate. And at times it was very easy to feel a little bit like I'd been left behind. What have I been doing for the past 3 years? But with all of that said, I loved being in a university. I cared about universities. I cared about the staff, the students who were working there, and I cared so much about my discipline, English. I saw a job advertised running events for the Institute of English Studies, and I applied for it. I started in the role a month after my Viva, and clearly I haven't looked back since. At the Institute of English Studies, I worked on events, and then I also took on additional side projects in things like marketing and communications, which I've been telling Claire for 2 years now is called Marcoms. I also started to work with academic societies and various other projects. And after doing that for 2 years, I've recently been promoted to the Institute Manager, meaning I'm responsible in consultation with our wonderful director, Claire, who you already heard from, for the budget, the strategy, the planning, and the day-to-day running of the Institute. Moving from a postgraduate research student role to a professional services role in a university has been incredibly interesting and enriching. And it's also involved all sorts of challenges. I've had to learn so much about how universities and businesses operate, or sometimes fail to operate, and also try and get my head around, how to read a fairly unwieldy financial spreadsheet. The other main challenge that I found in lots of ways is that it's a completely different pace of work to my PhD. One of the biggest challenges in my current role is actually carving out time to focus on tasks rather than rushing through everything and responding to every email that comes in. So I do really miss that kind of long period of thought and reflection that researching and studying provided me with. But learning how to research and reflect, I think, is one of the key skills that I developed in my PhD that I find really useful now. There are so many transferable skills from my PhD that I use all the time in my current role. Our other panelists have touched on lots of them already, writing skills, being able to motivate yourself, managing your own time, distilling information and presenting it to different audiences, public speaking, presentation skills. I'm really lucky in that my current role also makes a lot of use of my subject-specific knowledge. I understand and I care very deeply about the discipline of English, and I get to use that knowledge and that passion all the time. My current role involves thinking about the discipline of English very holistically. For example, when we're planning events like this one, or thinking strategically about the future of our institution. I also find that speaking the language of the academy and the discipline is absolutely invaluable in my current role, and it can make a lot of stakeholder relationships much easier that I already have that language and that skill. So for PhD students who are considering moving into professional services, I'd say a few things. I'm happy to answer more questions on this during the Q&A. First of all, there are lots of other professional services staff who have a research background. You will be amongst friends. It's also an exciting and dynamic workspace. It's a lovely way of keeping in touch with your research background, whilst also being part of a bigger team and organisation, and that's something I really value. Lots of professional services staff find opportunities to continue their research or use it in their work. You are still part of a university, so you'll have access to libraries and resources, and that can make a really big difference. When I finished my PhD, what I did know quite clearly was that I didn't really want to leave universities and the academy and higher education. I really liked them as a place to work. I liked being around academics. But I increasingly realized I didn't really want a research career. And a basic part of that was that I knew I was extremely unlikely to immediately secure a 9-to-5 permanent role if I continued down the academic research route. Working in professional services has given me that, but it has also allowed me the opportunity to continue serving the discipline and the academy that I care so much about. So I'm going to wrap up there, which gives us plenty of time for questions, and I'll hand back over to Liz.
Thank you very much, Ellie. And thank you to all our speakers. I think we've heard some real common themes. We've heard some absolute inspiration. And I think the liveliness of the question and answer shows that. So what I would ask everybody, all the participants, this is your chance to upvote questions. So we've got 20 questions open at the moment. I've been going through, seeing which are the most popular. But if you want to upvote a question or you want to type in your own question, then this is your chance. Just for the panelists, I'm going to start with the ones which are addressed to everybody, and then if we have time, we've got just over 20 minutes, so I will cover as many as I can in that time. And the question that I would like to start with is the one that went up first from Chiara and provoked real conversation in the chat box. So I'm actually going to read out some of the comments, because this is a question that I get as a careers consultant, and I think it's a common fear. So thank you, for Chiara, for bringing that out into the light. You know, where might having a PhD be seen as a hindrance or negative with employers? And then other students have contributed their comments about they were overqualified, that they've been advised to minimize their PhD on their CV. And then someone saying, well, how do we counter it? If that is the case, how do we counteract it? So that worry, I think, is common. So could I ask, perhaps starting in the same order as we ran before, so I can start off with you, Beth, your comments on that concern?
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that out of what I said, Chiara, because it's something that I very deliberately mentioned, because it was a huge fear of mine. I know it's a huge fear of a lot of my peers. And then actually, in a couple of different jobs that I've had, I've heard sort of flippant comments which have really cut to my core. Things like, oh, I worked with somebody who had a doctorate before, and, you know, very clever but no common sense, very clever but no common sense. And that just really rattled me. I think that, you know, we can do work to sort of reframe this narrative. And something that really helped me was when I was advised to basically write about my PhD twice on my CV. So have it in the kind of education section, but also have it in the employment section. It fills out the kind of worrying gap that you have sort of between 2016 and 2020, where I didn't have kind of continuous employment. But you frame it as a job, because it is a job, right? So you organize conferences, you teach, you develop all the skills that everybody talked about over the last half an hour, 40 minutes. And I did actually, I noticed an uptick in the number of invitations I got to interview when I did that.
Great tip, which is immediately going into my armory for PhD CV advice. You know, I would just ask Maria, anything you want to add about this concern about whether PhD can see as a negative?
Yeah, so I touched a little bit about it when I spoke in the panel. I think the main challenge with PhDs is that in some ways, yes, you're overqualified, but in some ways it also looks like you may not have enough relevant experience on paper. And I agree with Beth that you really need to foreground the way in which the PhD really is a job and really is something that affords you skills, all sorts of sets of skills. I didn't put my PhD on my CV as a job on its own. I wrote about that in my application. I spoke about that in my interview, but I did list all of the other things that I did during my PhD separately on my CV under the various sections. I talked about my teaching experience. I talked about my, conference organization experience, any sort of outreach that I did, all of those things, I listed them. And it really shows all of the skills that you have, organizational, you know, in terms of obtaining funding, everything. So yeah, I think that's why it might seem sometimes like a PhD isn't a good thing to have going back into the world of work outside of academia, but that's a misconception, and I think we can all show that it is a misconception. I don't think all employees, all employers have that misconception. So it's worth keeping in mind that our fear perhaps is stronger than the reality of how our PhDs are viewed in the world.
And I would just really like to endorse that point from Maria about the fear being stronger than the reality. My observation of the job market is that the sign of excellence and expertise that a doctorate gives is becoming more valued in the 20 years I have been working with PhD students, but the fear levels remain the same. Employers are basically concerned about whether you can do the job with them and whether you're going to get on with your colleagues. They don't really care what you did before, if they are convinced that actually you are going to help them sleep better at night. And if you want more of that perspective, then the session we're finishing this event with will explore that a little more. So I'm just conscious of time. So Emma and Ellie, if you want to sort of signal with your hand, if you've got anything to add to Beth's and Maria's message on this. I mean, the message I got from what's been said is it's presented as a job, pull those skills out. As we say. So Ellie, you wanted to add something.
I'm just going to chime in very briefly, and I think it speaks to what we were just talking about, this fear being greater than the reality. But I also think a myth that's primarily perpetuated from within higher education is this sense that like academic work is not real work, it's not real life, that we're this magical closed enclave of, you know, where magical research happens. And I don't think there are very many employers who look at it like that. But I think one of the important things as an applicant for a job is to not let yourself get drawn into that narrative, for you to see it as a job, for you to see it as real life work, real work, and to not worry that, you know, it's hidden behind the walls of universities where magic, non-real things happen. So that was what I wanted to add to that point.
And it's such a helpful point. And you, as English PhDs, are so well placed to understand different narratives and rhetorics, framing and semiotics. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But I do think it's right. The thought that came to me as Ellie was talking was about this idea of, you know, muggle and non-muggle, for those of you who are Harry Potter fans. Don't hurt yourself with that. Make sure you take time to think about what are the different ways of telling the story. I think it was Beth talked about her storytelling in her work and framing that narrative. Okay, so just conscious of time, so I want to move on to another difficult question. I want to thank the person who put that. So you're absolutely welcome to put questions in as anonymous, and I think it does enable sometimes to name the hard stuff. So Emma and Ellie, you're going to start with this one. So Emma in a moment. Which is people asking about, you know, starting off with low-paid drudge work. So we've had a number of questions, people saying, oh, you know, to get started, you know, the entry-level work, for example, in publishing, is low paid? Is it worth the experience? And I'd like to sort of amplify that by saying that something that I say sometimes to PhD students is, you know, sometimes leaving your PhD, there is a pivot moment, and you do start at entry-level work, but you will accelerate faster. So Emma, I would value your perspective on that.
Thanks, Liz. And yeah, I would absolutely echo the point that you've just made. So in publishing, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. Your entry-level job will not be the best paid job at all. I remember my entry-level job was actually lower than my PhD stipend when I first started, which was a bit of a struggle for me, actually. And I did take on some freelance editing work part-time on top of that full-time job. That was 10 years ago now, 10 years plus, and I know things are changing for the better in publishing, in the publishing industry in general. So I think that entry-level role won't be as bad as it was back in my day. But to your point, Liz, about being able to accelerate quicker once you've started, absolutely. You know, doing a PhD in will help you sort of hit the ground running in an academic publishing role. That knowledge of the research landscape that you've got, your ability to understand authors' needs because of that knowledge, project management skills, all those transferable skills we've been pulling out today. You know, you're putting yourself in a really brilliant position to be able to take off and then move through the steps quite quickly in publishing. And many publishers have quite sort of a set linear progression still through various editorial roles. So yes, I don't think you'll be sort of carrying out that quite low paid drudge work, to use your term, but actually it's less drudge work and more kind of an interesting introduction into the publishing industry, I think, that editorial assistant role. So it might be a little difficult to begin with, but it won't be forever.
Super. Anyone want to raise their hand to add anything more to what Emma has said? Any of you? Does that ring true from what you've said?
Yes, it definitely rings true for me as well. I think entry-level jobs in journalism are also not very well paid, unfortunately, so you might struggle for a little while. I certainly did when I started. However, I'll echo what you said, Liz, that first of all, I think it's you're going to get that non-academic job probably faster than you get a full-time permanent academic job, and also you will progress much faster as well. And it's not drudge work. It's in my experience, it was really interesting. So yeah, but it is something that you need to be aware of. It's not going to be a lot of money to begin with, possibly. Depends on your circumstances, I'm sure.
So I think what we're hearing is a sort of say there is that pivot element, and this is true for many career redirections, where, you know, to build the credibility, the contacts, the experience, you know, you go in at entry level. But what I heard both of you say was for a while. And I think so if you think of it as a 3 to 5 year trajectory, just as your PhD had a trajectory to it, that may make, you know, may give you more confidence that it will be worth, if there's an area you're interested in, it is worth almost seeing your entry level job as your post PhD sort of professional training or credibility building experience that then allows you to establish yourself in a new field. So, and I'm saying lots of reassuring nods from Maria. So thank you for that. While I've got Maria on the microphone, there's a question that's come up about working in a STEM field with a non-STEM experience, and that's been upvoted quite a lot. So could you say a little bit about what it's like to be as a humanities graduate working in the STEM field?
I think at first it was quite scary. I was a bit worried about getting things wrong. However, first of all, your colleagues are going to support you in the beginning. You're going to have to learn a few things anyway, and you're just going to pick them up. I learned really fast. It wasn't really that difficult, to be honest. It was no different from covering any other topic that I wasn't familiar with to begin with, but then you learn about it. You just do a little bit of research. You ask researchers to explain what they've done. You use that if we're talking from a science communication perspective. And I guess I wasn't completely unfamiliar with that sort of general area, because I had taught science communication to undergraduates previously in sort of chemistry and physics departments. So I understood the importance of properly communicating scientific concepts. I think it just sounds like something that's going to be difficult, but it really isn't. I think if you know how to use words, if you know how to write, if you know how to communicate, and if you know how to go about doing your own research, you'll be fine.
Super, thank you. And I just love that. If you know how to use words, and I think something we've had from the moment when Claire gave her introduction, the one thing that you as English PhD students are, you are masters of how words are used in different ways. And I think we're getting a message of our 4 panelists are using words. I tell you, I never say no to Ellie. I think, it's that magical power again. So I just wanted to ask Beth if she'll lead on a question, which comes from, I'm reading the version from Kiri, but actually there's been a number of versions of this. But I'm going to read Kiri's. I know all PhDs are by definition niche. Do employers ever really care about the topic of your PhD, or is it more about transferable skills? And Kiri shares that they, like you, are a medievalist. And feeling that topic, and we may have people, other disciplines who may feel that I think Claire has probably put a camera on as soon as I mentioned the word medieval, but I'm sure that's not limited to those who study medieval literature. And Kiri, you say, I often despair that anyone would want to hire me. I am so hoping that by now that despair is lifting. But can I hand over to Beth to address this issue? Do they care about the topic? Is it about transferable skills?
I would love to think that they do care about the topic. In my job, they really do. When it comes to things like I'm doing a heritage trail for one of the towns, the town Keynsham. It's a medieval name, and there's a story about a saint who made her home on the banks of the river there, and there are schools named after that, and people really adopt these as part of their kind of collective narrative of the local area. So in that sense, very much yes. I would also argue that this is the story of you. This is what you have spent your time doing for the last 5 years, or however many years you've spent doing your PhD. And while you don't necessarily want to get into the small technicalities of your research subject, what you do want to do is convey that it's what you love and it's what you're interested in and it's what makes you in the same way that if you put on a CV your kind of personal interests, it's the kind of collective makeup of an individual. So I think niche interests are positive, whilst also being able to articulate all the things that we've already talked about, the kind of transferable hard skills and soft skills that all of my colleagues here have.
And Claire, do you want to, seeing you unread, I wonder whether you wanted to say a few words on that.
Well, I have a talk that I've wanted to give and may well give about medievalists in public places, because in fact medievalists pop up all over the place. And I sort of have I have an allergy about niche areas of research, because in a sense we're all doing niche areas. And I think that's within academia, it's within teaching, and it's also out with academia in other worlds. So I completely applaud what Beth has said, in fact, which is it's about you and it's about a story you can tell. And I think people are more interested in research and our ideas than we probably give them credit for. And at least I can think of some of the careers that I listed at the beginning in my welcome. I was thinking of medievalists who are in those roles. So do not despair. I think go for it. It is all our subjects are amazing. It's how we tell that story.
And while I have you on the microphone, Claire, if I could start a sentence on independent scholarship. So that was something that Maria mentioned, and it's been picked up in the chat box. And I've certainly come across a number of colleagues who have PhDs who are working in one career, but continue, particularly using social media, to have identity as independent scholar. I wonder whether you had any examples of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly at the Institute, actually, some of our fellows are indeed independent scholars. And it is something that we are actively within the Institute trying to think about how we can support more, because one of the things, I forget who said it, is it's useful to have, if you're going to do independent research, and I think it's great that you want access to libraries, I think. So finding ways to support you, I think this is my job, it's our job, to find ways to help you continue your research. But I think, again, there are many different routes to research, and independent researchers are a really valuable asset increasingly. And to pick up again on something that Beth said about funding, I think there's the funding landscape for independent researchers, or researchers who of all different fields, in different communities, in different places, who want to work with perhaps academics in universities. I think there are funding streams these days, and I think that's an area that actually is being invested in. So watch this space. We'll try and do more for you, and I'll give it to Ellie, and she can put on the website.
Thank you, Claire. And as you know, that certainly that's an area, and from my experience with the doctoral training partnership, where we'd look at independent scholarship, my top tip with that would be is you have to use social media as your arena. So actually looking at other people who are operating as independent scholars, seeing how they're getting their message across and raising their profile, as Claire says, a more receptive environment than I have ever seen for the concept of the rigorous independent scholar. So again, a bit like I'm finishing where Beth started us off, which said there are opportunities available that did not exist 10 years ago. just as well as the opportunities that perhaps have been superseded. Now, I'm conscious of the time and I want to do my thank yous properly. There are quite a lot of questions about where you find job opportunities. Now, that I'm going to address by adding a slide to the slides that I will share from my session later in the day. So there's a number of questions about how you put CVs across, where you find jobs, that we will be addressing in the session at 4 o'clock, or I will add additional references to those slides when we put them up on the website. So don't think those questions have been ignored. Of course, we will capture them all, and those we haven't been able to address directly now, we will try and find ways in addressing it in the materials we make available afterwards. But I would just really, and I'm very glad also to have Claire on screen, because she and I are just full of gratitude for what I think has been one of the most inspirational alumni panels that I have ever chaired. And considering I've been doing this for 32 years, that's quite something. This is a day I'm not going to forget. I think every single one of our speakers has spoken from the heart and spoken with encouragement. So I do hope that all of you are now starting to give a greater sense of possibility and a greater sense of strategy. We are now going to go into the break. And I think if you can, please do go move about so you don't get the Zoom fatigue we all know. But please also do come back, because we're going to have a different angle from Dr. Kate Daubney. I get my Kates and my Claires confused. Kate Daubney, who's going to be giving her perspective, again, as another PhD graduate, on the value of an English PhD. And so she's going to give our keynote at 3:35. So do be sure to come back from that. Super. Marie said, Maria, certainly if you give me the details, we'll include it in our follow-up literature. So that would be terrific. Thank you. And I'd love to read it. So I'm going to draw this session to a close, bang on 3:20, with a warm thank you to our panelists, and also to all of those of you who put questions into the chat box and made this such a lively and engaging session. We're now going to close Q&A and open the chat box for the rest of the event, so you can also continue to put comments in the chat, and we'll be using that for the rest of the event. So I'll see you all after the break. Thank you very much.